Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to another lecture in our series devoted to the analysis of poetry. This is the third lecture to deal with the dramatic monologue, one of my favorite poetic genres. In lecture 1, we examined Michael Drayton's The Parting, a Renaissance poem and an early example of the dramatic monologue. In lecture 2, we examined Browning's great poem, My Last Duchess. Today, we are also going to be looking at a Victorian dramatic monologue, this one by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson lived from 1809 to 1892, and he is regarded by many as the archetypal Victorian poet. He succeeded William Wordsworth as Poet Laureate in 1850. It is easy and very unfair to caricature Tennyson, this bearded, patriarchal figure. Many young readers probably know Tennyson's poetry only through an instantly memorable poem glorifying the power, the fatal power and beauty of the eagle. It runs, he clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed by the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Other readers who know a little more tend to mock Tennyson for the official works that he had to write as Poet Laureate. Of these, the most notorious is The Charge of the Light Brigade, which deals with a disastrous, if heroic, blunder during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. Many of you know it, I'm sure, with the half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, etc. Such simplifications are grotesquely unfair to Tennyson, one of the most accomplished poets in the history of English literature. His poems range from the lyrical to the despairing, from the meditative to the profoundly philosophical, from the personal exploration to the public assertion. Tennyson's works cover everything. One of the central concerns of his poems certainly is the conflict between the private figure and the public figure. Jerome H. Buckley, a great literary historian, has spoken of the two worlds of Tennyson. And this phrase, I think, is a very interesting and apt one. Tennyson constantly wrestled with the problem. Should a poet become a societal spokesperson? Should he become an influence within the world? Or will that corrupt his art? However, if he withdraws into a palace of art, and there is a famous long poem by Tennyson entitled The Palace of Art, is he not betraying his commitment to humanity? Should he not be doing more? How does one reconcile a life of the intellect with a life of action? How does one reconcile introspection with adventure? How does one reconcile the poet and the public man? This concern dominates a great many of Tennyson's most famous poems, including my personal favorite, his tragic Arthurian work, The Lady of Shalott. This is a profoundly ambiguous poem in which the Lady of Shalott does choose life, passion, action, but with tragic consequences. She leaves the magic web of her tapestry. She leaves the shadows of life that flicker in her magic mirror. She looks down to Camelot, inspired to do so by her glimpse of Sir Lancelot in the mirror, and the results are fatal for her. So the dilemma remained with Tennyson, and it is a very complex dilemma, and it is certainly present in the great dramatic monologue, Ulysses, which focuses on individual commitment and public duty, and the extraordinary difficulty of reconciling the two of them. It is important to examine Tennyson's life in a little more detail as it relates to Ulysses and his other poems. Tennyson was a child prodigy. He started writing poetry when he was a very young boy, at about 5, and he became an accomplished poet when he was at university. He went to Cambridge in 1827, and there he met Arthur Henry Hallam, who many people regard as the muse of Tennyson's poetry. Hallam was a scholar of Italian literature, a great admirer of the Romantic poets, an immensely gifted young man in his own right. He, in fact, ensured that Tennyson became an admirer of the lyricism and the technical virtuosity of the Romantic poets, and particularly of John Keats. However, Hallam died horrifyingly when he was very young indeed, only 22. He died of a brain tumor in Vienna in 1833, and Tennyson was devastated by the loss of this most intimate and influential of friends. And in fact, the death of Hallam shapes Tennyson's life to an enormous extent. To give you one fascinating and very dramatic example, Tennyson met and fell in love with Emily Selwood. They apparently reached an understanding as early as 1830 and became engaged in 1838, but they did not marry until 1850. Some literary historians insist that the delay was financial, but that seems rather fatuous to me. Tennyson was wrestling with his extreme grief over the death of Hallam, and he really reached closure, to use that modern term, only in 1850, when his magnum opus, the great In Memoriam, a series of magnificent elegies dedicated to the memory of Hallam, was published anonymously. In Memoriam is a truly magnificent work. In it, Tennyson wrestles with his doubts, his own personal agony. He examines the clash between attitudes towards religion and evolution within Victorian society, and he strives to find renewed faith in the midst of despair. Many still regard the poem as a great and consoling work, with its emphasis on renewal. Ring happy bells across the snow, ring out the old, ring in the new, ring in the Christ that is to be, etc. Others see it as an extraordinary work of despair. T.S. Eliot has commented that In Memoriam is a great and despairing work because its despair has a religious intensity. However you interpret this remarkable work, it certainly assisted Tennyson to move forward in life, and that's very, very important indeed. So how does all of this relate to Tennyson's Ulysses, which is, after all, the center of our discussion today? Ulysses appeared in autumn 1833, when Tennyson's grief over the death of Hallam was at its most intense and oppressive. And Tennyson himself was quite explicit about why he wrote Ulysses. He saw it as part of his struggle to go forward and brave, and he uses the word braving the struggle of life, and brave whatever remained for him in the future. So bear that in mind, bear these biographical details in mind when you read this extraordinary poem, an early masterpiece by Tennyson. However, this particular poem, Ulysses, described by Harold Bloom as an equivocal, dramatic monologue, also requires you to have some knowledge of classical mythology. At least you must know something about the eponymous Ulysses himself. Odysseus, Ulysses, is an immensely complex hero in classical mythology. He was king of Ithaca, and of course he was one of the great warriors who fought in the 10-year war against Troy. Some mythological sources state that the scheme of the wooden horse, the ruse that eventually brought about the destruction of Troy, that scheme was the brainchild of Ulysses. He is not simply a warrior hero. He is the man of wiles, the man of ideas. He is a brilliant strategist as well, and that is important to remember. 10 years spent in war against Troy, and then 10 years on the homeward voyage. Ulysses endures much suffering and is involved in many extraordinary adventures on the long journey back to Ithaca. Because, of course, as you know, there isn't time to discuss this in great detail, the gods in Homer take sides in the Greek and Trojan War, and many of the gods are out to get Ulysses on his way back because of his destruction of the mighty palaces, the great city of Troy. So Ulysses' many adventures on the voyage home involve gods and monsters and seductresses. Some of the most memorable figures include the one-eyed Cyclops Polyphemus, the sorceress seductress Circe who turns men into beasts, the fatally alluring sirens, and so many others. Ultimately, he does return to Ithaca, where his long-suffering, faithful wife Penelope awaits him. She has been beset by ambitious and even vicious suitors, but she has managed cunningly to keep them at arm's length, and she is reunited with her husband. And Tennyson's dramatic monologue begins with the returned Ulysses. He is back on Ithaca, he has been back for 3 years, and we look at him responding to ordinary life after all the adventures in the past. Now, Tennyson, influenced by his knowledge of the classics, obviously drew upon Homer, but also, very importantly, he drew upon another archetype of Ulysses, the Ulysses icon, if you like, that was created by Dante and is present in Dantes Inferno. In Canto 26 of Dante's Inferno, Dante and his guide Virgil encounter Ulysses. And interestingly, they encounter Ulysses in the part of hell which is devoted to the counselors of fraud. And Ulysses speaks to them from the heart of flickering flame. This presentation of Ulysses is very, very ambivalent indeed. He is the cunning, fraudulent counselor, but he is also given by Dante a splendor, an extraordinary commitment to gaining the most out of life and exploring life to the full. It is in fact in Dante that Ulysses states, speaking to his followers, "You were not made to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge. You were not made to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge." And that line could well have come from Tennyson's poem. You could see it as the inspiration for Tennyson's dramatic monologue and his very complex and ambivalent depiction of the figure of Ulysses. Ulysses, constantly discontented, a magnificent exploring intellect, a seeker after truth, but also at the same time a self-centered adventurer. And as always, when we're reading a dramatic monologue, we must look at nuances of response. Do we simply blindly admire Tennyson's Ulysses, or do we criticize his neglect of his duties? Or, and this is the correct answer, both, for this is an extremely complex poem. Now let's look at it in a little more detail. Tennyson's poem opens with an outburst of discontent and anger. Ulysses is frustrated, bored by his life on Ithaca. He sees it as having no profit at all. He sees himself as an idle king, an interesting adjective, who meets and doles, measures out grudgingly to his people, whom he describes as a savage race, unequal laws. He sees his country as barren, these barren crags, and he describes his wife Penelope as aged. It is, one could argue, quite a savage outburst. The adjectives accumulate, and they are all insulting. And in a way, we recoil somewhat from Ulysses for all the force and vigour of his rhetoric. This does seem somewhat unjust. After all, Penelope has become the iconic faithful wife in mythology. She endured hardships, even peril, and remained faithful to her absent husband absent for 20 years. And after all, if she is an aged wife, then he too is an aged husband, an aged king. However, it would be simplistic to say that we condemn Ulysses utterly. We feel the frustration of a remarkably heroic man who is now trapped or feels trapped in ordinary life. He cannot cease from exploring, and he insists that he will drink life to the lees. Now, this is a marvelous image, because when you drink a bottle of wine, that residue that is left at the bottom of the bottle when you've really drained it, the dregs, if you like, that residue is called the lees. And what Ulysses is saying here is that he cannot bear simply to sip or sample experience. He has to explore experience fully, because that is what he did in the past. Notice, though, that he is not committing himself to a hedonistic existence. What he demands from life is fullness, complexity. He has suffered greatly, as well as felt intense joy. He has delighted in every aspect of life, sometimes with his followers, those who loved and supported him, sometimes on his own. He has endured storms at sea. He speaks of the Hyades, a cluster of stars attached to the constellation Taurus, stars that are meant to herald the coming of rain and turbulence at sea. So he speaks of the Hyades and of the dangers encountered on the vexed, dim sea. But he also speaks of all the people whom he encountered, men and mammals, governments, councils, and he asserts the fact that he was not least among them. He was revered. He was treated with respect as a great hero. He has become, and he is very aware of this, an icon, an iconic figure. He has become the representative hero who is always traveling with a hungry heart, who is never contented to settle down. Ulysses speaks of himself as a weapon in a sense. He speaks of himself as being like a sword, and it is pointless for a sword to rust unused. And this is how he feels, governing his bleak kingdom once more, like a weapon that is no longer in use. He, after all, was a great warrior hero, and he fought in the great battles round Troy. Tennyson uses the most amazing image to sum up Ulysses' view of his experiences at Troy. He delighted in battle. Ulysses drank the joy of battle on the ringing plains of windy Troy. And this is a lovely example of what we call a transferred epithet, an adjective that is transferred to another noun for dramatic effect. So let's examine the transferred epithet in more detail. What actually rang on the plains of Troy? The weapons used in battle, swords clashing against swords, spears clashing against spears, etc. That's the ringing. But Tennyson manages to capture through this transferred epithet a sense of the vastness of the battle. The entire plain seems to be ringing with the noise of weapons used against other weapons. It is a most remarkable and remarkably succinct image, capturing the splendor and also the horror of war. On the plains of windy Troy, these vast armies are in conflict. So let us pause what Ulysses hates to do, and examine what we have established so far. Ulysses speaks with disgust, and the word is not too strong, of his nation, of his island of Ithaca, his people, and his life there. Tennyson's poem is written in iambic pentameter, and Tennyson uses this metrical form to emphasize Ulysses' disgust directed at his people. Look at that amazing line in which Ulysses insists that his subjects hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. All those verbs are very disparaging indeed. Hoard suggests a greedy accumulation of wealth or possessions. Sleep, obviously, suggests inactivity. Feed is a verb usually applied to animals, not human beings. We would say eat. And above all, the supreme insult to Ulysses is that they cannot begin to understand him. They are, in his eyes, selfish, self-centered, ignorant beings who cannot in any way probe the adventurous spirit of a man like Ulysses. He is not prepared to be the unburnished sword. He wishes to shine in use. Now, is he simply a deluded older man? Is he not prepared to acknowledge the fact that he himself has aged and that he might not be capable of the great adventures of his past? He is aware that he has aged. He acknowledges the fact that much is lost, but insists that much also remains. He uses the image of experience as an arch, and you look through an arch, you see more possibilities and yet more possibilities. An infinity of experiences stretches before one when one looks through an arch, and one must never abandon the spirit of adventure. Nevertheless, there is pain and poignancy in the diction that he uses as well. He speaks of his spirit as grey, and he speaks of following knowledge like a sinking star, a poignant image that, beyond all the boundaries that men have previously explored. So in this poem, Tennyson enables Ulysses to show both self-knowledge and a desire for the quest to continue. He will not abandon the adventures. He will not abandon the exploration, but he is aware that he has aged and that much has been lost. This is not simply a deluded older man clinging to the triumphs of his youth. Not at all. Ulysses is not prepared to store and hoard himself. He believes that possibilities remain for him. He has to seek them out. The journey must continue. At this point in the poem, we do feel a sense of his splendor. I think we are filled with admiration. As I've already stressed, he is not simply going off in quest of pleasures, not at all. He is going forth to seek experience, and if that experience involves suffering and pain, so be it. He wishes to have all the complexity of experience that he encountered on his adventures. But then he turns to consider the situation on the island of Ithaca, and he refers to his son Telemachus. Now, critics are divided over this section of the poem. All critics regard, quite rightly, this as a very, very great poem. But some critics are more critical of the adventurer hero Ulysses himself and insist that Tennyson is actually satirizing this urge to continue the quest, this urge in what is, after all, an aged man. So let us look at what could be called the Telemachus section of the poem. Ulysses observes, "This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to to whom I leave the sceptre and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labour by slow prudence, to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centred in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his work, I mine. What are the qualities of Telemachus that Ulysses lists here? He is practical, he is efficient, he can govern a land. He belongs in a domestic and political world. He will offer suitable, meet there is an adjective that means suitable, respect to the household gods, and he will perform all the duties that a good and efficient ruler should perform. However, the descriptions that Ulysses uses are rather unexciting, are they not? And some of them can be regarded as rather condescending too. Slow, prudent, common duties. We are presented with a hard-working, virtuous, rather dull figure. Does Ulysses denigrate his son? No. He is fully aware that his son is an admirable man. But at the same time, he is unexcited by the admirable qualities of his son. They are not qualities that he embraces with any intensity. And it's important, I think, to understand this. Some critics argue, oh heavens, he's so patronizing to Telemachus. Others say, no, he acknowledges his son's virtues. It is a mixture of the two. He does acknowledge Telemachus's virtues, but they are not virtues that he wishes to dominate his life. That is the key point. And that wonderful antithetical statement which ends off that section, he works his work, I mine, magnificently sums up the point that I am making. He does his job, I do mine, and the two cannot meet. This is his commitment, mine is very different. An antithesis is, as you know, a balance of opposites, and this is a devastatingly succinct antithetical statement. Telemachus pursues his path, I pursue mine. Now, in the next section of this remarkable poem, we become very aware of just who Ulysses' listeners are. As you remember from our definition of a dramatic monologue, there are implied listeners. To whom is Ulysses speaking? And we discover, it is made clear to us, that he is actually speaking to his mariners. This is, if you like, a public speech. It is an exhortatory speech. He is trying to inspire them to embark on this final journey with him. He introduces Telemachus in a sense. Telemachus is well known to the people of Ithaca, but he pays homage to him before the mariners who are going to accompany him on his voyage. This is my son, he will take over in my absence. And then he turns to them and he speaks directly about what he plans to do. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas. My mariners, and they are listening to him, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. He is inspiring his mariners to accompany him. And notice the contrast between his mariners and the way they acted in the past, and the way his subjects, in Ulysses' view, act all the time. His subjects hoard and sleep and feed and know not him, whereas his mariners, and the verbs he used are very interesting indeed, toiled and wrought. They worked, they labored for me. Wrought suggests they created, they planned, they created with me. All his ambitions were shared by them. They acted with him. They were a completely united force. Ulysses emphasizes too that they brought to their commitment to him in the past. And these are wonderful phrases, I think, that you will and must remember. They brought free hearts, free foreheads. The heart, of course, is the center of emotions, so they freely chose to follow him. Their emotions were committed to him. But they also followed him with insight and thought. They brought to their adventures free hearts and free foreheads. And this is perhaps a good point to examine a technique that Tennyson uses frequently in Ulysses. And to understand its effectiveness, you have to learn two terms which might be unfamiliar to you. The first term is metonymy, M-E-T-O-N-Y-M-Y. Metonymy is a figure of speech in which you substitute a quality or attribute of a thing for the thing itself. And we use metonymy in everyday speech all the time, often without realizing that we are doing so. When you speak of the press to stand for the power of journalism, you are using metonymy. When you say the Crown has issued a statement, the Crown stands for monarchy, the power of monarchical rule, that is metonymy. Those of you who know the cliched saying, the pen is mightier than the sword, you are using metonymy there as well. The pen stands for words, language, thought, ideas. The sword, of course, stands for irrational violence. All of these are metonymies. Closely linked to metonymy is another figure of speech which you must also know, and it is called synecdoche, spelt S-Y-N-E-C-D-O-C-H-E. Do not pronounce it Synecdoche. The correct pronunciation is synecdoche. So when, for example, you say, entering that club will cost 50 rand per head, you obviously mean 50 rand per person. Head stands for person. When a captain of a ship calls all hands on deck, he obviously doesn't want the sailors to sever their hands and toss them onto the deck. He wants all the sailors to appear. These are examples of synecdoche. Synecdoche can also be whole for part. For example, if you speak of South Africa for the South African cricket team, you are using whole for part, and that too is synecdoche. Sometimes it can be a little troubling when you're analysing poetry and you ask yourself, oh, is this metonymy, is this synecdoche? Think carefully. It's not always all that important to quibble over the terminology, but Tennyson uses metonymy very, very successfully indeed here. Forehead to stand for human thought, heart to stand for human emotion, thunder to stand for trouble and suffering, sunshine to stand for joy, and so on. Ulysses is trying to inspire mariners to accompany him, and he emphasizes the promise and the mystery of the adventure that awaits them. He would gesture towards the ships that await. Is he speaking to them in the harbor? It seems as if he is. He is addressing this crowd of mariners. There is the ship. Its sails puffed out. There is the sea, the dark sea, with all its mysteries. The descriptions here are very Homeric. A Homeric epithet used throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey is the wine-dark sea. And Tennyson has a marvelous echo of this when he speaks of, there lies the port, the vessel puffs her sails, their gloom, the dark, broad seas. Now again, when you look at this section of the poem, consider whether he is self-deluded or simply courageous and magnificent. Does he acknowledge his own weakness here? Well, he does, actually. He speaks of the fact that death closes all. And he acknowledges the fact that he and his mariners have grown old and they are weakened by time. However, he says, they will still be able to perform exploits that are not unworthy of those who did battle with gods and monsters. Let's read exactly what Ulysses says. Some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. That not unbecoming men that strove with gods is very effective because it is a sublime use of understatement. He is saying, of course, we can still have an adventure that is worthy of great heroes. But he says that is not unbecoming, not unsuited to men who did battle with the gods. This is, in a sense, a very manipulative piece of oratory. He uses all the devices possible to inspire his men to embark with him on this final great adventure. He reminds them of the unity, the heroism, the commitment of the past. He points out that other adventures still await them. He acknowledges with realism that they are old indeed, they have been weakened by time, but that they can still live up to their legends, the heroes of the past. He also acknowledges in his imagery that darkness is descending. And let's look at these very, very beautiful lines. Darkness is descending, literally, the day is ending. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Now look at the way Tennyson exploits their long vowel sounds and enjambment to create a sense of the coming of darkness and the mysteries that await. As darkness descends, the sea seems to be filled with mysterious promises and risks. And then the command, come my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. And look at the commands there, the verbs that he uses. Come, push off, smite the sounding furrows. Smite, beat the waves themselves and push off the ship and let us embark together. There's the acknowledgement of darkness coming and of course the symbolic suggestion of fading powers. He points to the reality of their existence and then inspires them with the imperatives. Come, push off, smite, strike, and we will go to places that men have never seen before. We might even go to paradise itself, to Elysium, and there we will see the great Achilles whom we knew. Achilles, the supreme hero of the Greeks in the Trojan War, and Ulysses reminds them all that he knew Achilles, that they have encountered the greatest heroes of all before. So these last sections of the poem are particularly effective because Ulysses does acknowledge the truth, the present truth. These are older men, much older men, embarking on a great final adventure. It will surely be their last. They have endured much. They have been weakened by time. Are they still capable of magnificent exploits? He insists that they are and inspires them to accompany him. And he concludes his extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary address to them with the following lines. We are not now the strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. And yet, he insists, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts made weak by time and fate. One equal temper of heroic hearts made weak by time and fate. Look at the balance of that. The word temper suggests, of course, metal again, the weapon image. A sword is tempered, molded, and it also suggests equal spirit and equal commitment. So we have been similarly molded and we share similar feelings and commitments because we all have heroic hearts. Yet he acknowledges that we have been made weak by time and by what we have endured, but we are still strong in will. He does not condescend to them. He does not hide the truth from them. He acknowledges the weakening effects of time, but insists that their heroism remains, their commitment remains, their unity remains, and they can still achieve much. Strong in will. And what is their will? Probably one of the most famous lines in all English poetry sums it up. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Again, a cluster of heavily accented verbs, but so very different from the verbs associated with Ulysses' rugged people, the savage race on Ithaca. They will strive. It means to attempt, to try. They will seek. They will search. They will succeed, he suggests. They will find. And above all, they will never surrender. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. It is a remarkable poem because it is the expression of a truly heroic temperament, one who will never give up, a man who will continue striving, who will continue his adventures because he is determined to gain knowledge which others have never had. Yet at the same time, Tennyson insists that those who go forward with daring obviously do leave suffering behind them. In order to embark on his great final adventure, Ulysses has to abandon wife and people yet again, and he must leave them in the hands of Telemachus. It could be argued, in fact, that Ulysses' adventurous spirit can thrive only because of the existence of people like Telemachus, who are prepared to stay home and do the less exciting work. It is an important point to remember. Harold Bloom puts it extremely well when he writes about this poem. Though Tennyson takes a high romantic view of Ulysses as a quester animated by heroic humanism and a sustained drive for knowledge, the poem persistently qualifies our admiration for its speaker. He appears to lack a capacity for loving other human beings, scorns his son's sense of responsibility, and in his final lines echoes the defiant Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost. Unquote. I'm not sure I agree with the defiant Satan reference there, but nevertheless Bloom's point is extremely well made. We must not idolize Tennyson's Ulysses, but nor must we be too critical of him. Tennyson is expressing his admiration for the adventurous spirit, the spirit that, regardless of suffering, and of course Tennyson is thinking of his own suffering over Hallam, is able to continue, and to continue with courage and dedication. But at the same time, there is awareness in Tennyson of the need for people to continue with ordinary life. We cannot all be heroic adventurers, and nor is the heroic adventurer entirely admirable. The heroic adventurer is heroic precisely because he is human, like all of us, has faults and weaknesses, but yet is determined to transcend them, to explore and to attempt to gain yet more before life is over, to seek, to strive, to find, and not to yield. There, Tennyson and his speaker Ulysses, the speaker who is being presented so critically in the poem, are indeed one. Here, Tennyson shares the aspirations of his hero and is saying this is what all human beings must attempt to do. Never yield, never give up, and continue to seek knowledge and experience which will expand our thoughts and transform our beings. This would appear to be a good moment at which to conclude our discussion of the dramatic monologue. I hope you've enjoyed the poems we analysed, and I trust you've grown to love this very interesting genre of poetry as much as I do. A reading of Tennyson's Ulysses in its entirety can be heard in the next segment. I would like to thank you all very much, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.